Tonight, I'm going to talk about taking refuge in the moment during times of fear and grief and the unknown. And, sort of from the kind of Buddhist teachings, the Buddha talked about taking refuge. And he said you could take refuge in the three jewels, taking refuge in the Buddha, which some people translate as the historical Buddha, but I myself and I think other folks kind of talk about that sort of the Buddha that lives within each one of us, the wise, awakened self. The Dharma, which can be translated as sort of like the Buddhist teachings, but in general can be translated just as sort of like the truth, the we can take refuge in the truth. So we can take refuge in the awakened one that exists within all of us, and we can take refuge in the truth. And then finally, taking refuge in the Sangha or community. And, you know, if you really knew me, you would know that like as a Dharma teacher, oftentimes I give these talks because they're relevant from what I am working on in my own life. And this year has certainly been, fear, grief, and uncertainty have been companions, probably more than I would have liked. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I work with them in my own life through practice, and then we'll talk a little bit about kind of how to work with the ways that there's fear, grief, and uncertainty in our world. Um, so if you really knew me, you would know that I have a little dog named Chulito. And in April, Chulito, who is already a tripod, broke one of his legs. And it was a really scary moment in itself. And it kind of continued to be pretty scary when we found out that the first surgery didn't work, and he had to have a second surgery. And then he wasn't really healing from the second surgery very well. And then they finally took off the bandages, and he was going to have a third surgery. And kind of in the middle of all of this, he received this treatment that was supposed to help his bone to heal better. And he's already a pretty fragile guy. He kind of came to me pretty fragile. But outside of sort of his medical list of things that have gone wrong, he's also my only family out here in New Mexico. My mom would disagree with that because I have a cousin who lives in Moriarty. I'm just not very close to her. So don't try to trip me up, Mom. I see you. But, Chulito is like in the morning, that's who I wake up with, and we play together. And yeah, I have my eye towards him all day. And he's really like my primary attachment figure. And so recently, um, he we put him through a I put him through a treatment that they said might help his leg, and he had a really awful response to it, and started like not greeting me when I came home and didn't want to be touched. And I could tell that he was in a lot of pain. And, it's my commitment to him not to keep him alive if he is in a lot of pain. And, I feel like, sort of the way that one of the pieces of how the Dharma shows up in my life is I'm not afraid to talk about death, even though it makes me really sad when I think about Chulito and dying. And I reached out to his veterinarian, who said there's one more medication that we can try. It seems that his system responds to sort of small signals of pain in large signals, and this would help to sort of change the way that his brain receives those signals. And she said, and if it doesn't work, then we'll need to think about how to compassionately end his life. And, if you can imagine someone who you're close to or a being that you feel connected to, when the possibility of that person or being not being there anymore, it's very destabilizing. And so, initially I was like, I'm just going to hold on to the hope. I'm just going to hold on to the hope. And, like I knew it took a couple days. I was like, I'm just going to hold on to the hope. And then I had a night where it was like the day was kind of rocky. And then the night came. And, you know what it was? I had a friend go, oh, that's awful. And she started crying. And then I was like, it is awful. And I think maybe what I didn't realize in that moment is that it was that, like, to consider this possible future was really, really scary and full of grief for me. But the sort of balancing and kind of other side of that reality is that it wasn't actually happening. Not at that moment. And so I had the experience of kind of falling into the grief, imagining what it would be like without him here, imagining what it would be like to have this process of losing him, imagining how one might come to that decision. And then realizing at a certain point that I was so overcome with sadness that I was at a point where it wasn't very helpful. It wasn't actually in service of anything other than to deeply overwhelm me. And I realized that I needed to bring in this practice of what's happening right here and right now. And this is something that I had practiced actually earlier in the year for myself. I'm someone who's had cancer, had a big surgery, and they did a CAT scan on me and they're like, we found a spot on your liver and a spot on your spleen. And I was like, you know, the whole cancer scare up again. And I'm like swimming in anxiety about what this means. And I'm like imagining that I have to move back to, California and abandon my life here. And it's like I have a crystal ball and it mostly reads the shittiest outcomes that could possibly, that I could possibly imagine. And I have to remember that. And the beauty of practice is that I know my mind. So I know that I have this crystal ball and it tells me the most awful things. And sometimes these awful things are realities that I may have to contend with. But there gets to be a point where it becomes actually really unhelpful. So when we're dealing with and we're sitting in the middle of kind of the intensity of like fear of the unknown, fear of what might come, the sense of like uncertainty, right? Because we don't know what will come, the possibility of deep grief. There's a way that understanding the way that our minds work and the patterns of our minds work can be really helpful. My dad is a really anxious person. And so I'll sometimes when I call for moral support, I'll say like, oh, I'm really anxious about that. And he's like, oh, that's weird. Because it's just understandable that that's how the minds in our household work. We are anxious people, and it has become some sort of a sweet identity that means membership into this family that I belong to, because we're anxious. So, right, this pattern of the mind, I can see the pattern and the way that my mind works. I can see that I am in the worst possible outcome. And in those moments when the fear is intense and the prediction about what is going to happen, there's actually a beautiful benefit that happens in going, I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that right now I am right here. And so there's some certainty and actually some fierceness with which we can connect with the moment as a refuge. Because the mind will continue to walk down that path. And I find that when it is a scary thought, it walks it much more regularly because our dear sweet mind is trying to figure out how to not feel scared anymore. But it does it by scaring the shit out of us, which is very unhelpful and also just true. So we know, okay, so I know, like, I have this mind that goes into anxiety. I know what the pattern looks like. I know where it usually takes me. I know that I'm going to walk this path over and over again because my mind is trying to figure out how not to be scared by scaring itself. And I can come back to the one thing that is certain, which is that I am here and now, even in this moment, feeling the feet or the hands. I notice I just took a deeper breath. This is a refuge right here, right now, because there's a lot of unknown, and this is incredibly concrete. I can tell you what I'm looking at. In fact, actually, I used to have a therapist that when we would have phone sessions, she'd ask me to describe where I was sitting and what I was looking at. I mean, talk about a mindfulness practice, but it's also a practice that supports the nervous system in settling. I had a good friend who was really panicking about something, and I was like, "Can you just maybe?" He was open to this coaching. I was like, Maybe try naming what you're seeing." And he was on a boat at the time, and he was like, bird, tree, I guess in the distance, like he was able to sort of name these things that he could see in the moment and really root down into his present moment experience in a way that provided refuge from where the mind was going. And sometimes, and actually I would say a lot of the times, actually I would say all of the times this year that I have been incredibly scared, it has been community, right? So when the Buddha talks about taking refuge in the Sangha, it has been, Sangha means community. It has been that practice, right? Here and now, what can I feel? What can I see? What can I hear, right? That orienting, that deep grounding in the moment, that's the practice, right? We're talking about like the cultivated awareness, right? Maybe the Buddha, the wise mind that's like, come back, be here now. But it's also been Sangha. So, for example, when I had the spots on my liver and spleen that they couldn't figure out, or they didn't know what it was, and I was going to have to go in for a test, I had friends that I would call, T being one of them. He's not an anxious oriented person. He has other challenges. That's not one of them. So he's one of the people that I call when I'm anxious, because I'm like, what is someone who doesn't have a crystal ball that says the worst things? What is that person? How does that person respond? Like, what's an alternative response to this situation? Because clearly I already said I'm from a family. We go anxious. So I'm like, what do other people do? How do other people think? I had another friend who was like, hey, by the way, I did some research on this because that would be a terrible idea for me. If I start WebMDing stuff, I'm dying. I need to be in urgent care. But I had this friend who had her full brain in a calm and relaxed place, and she was like, turns out that these spots tend to actually not be anything. So, oh, okay, getting other information, right, from other people with more settled nervous systems that are like, oh, actually there's enough reason to doubt the worst possible scenario, right? So we have this, right? So we can take refuge in our sort of wise mind that's here and now, that's like, right, this is what is constant, and and we are here and we can ground in it. And then sangha, right, these folks who are practitioners who can not only reflect like, oh, I could see what's going on in your mind. Here's how I might respond. Here, lean into my nervous system, use co-regulation to support. It's also these sort of dharmic truths. And I'll say this, sometimes the dharmic truths are like, they come through. Like, it's like, oh yeah, I hear a dharmic truth and I'm like, woo, I feel so grounded, so relieved. Like, this is great. And other times the dharmic truths, we have to be picky, right? Because it's like, I can go into the like, everything's impermanent. And then I'm just crying over how Chulito's life is impermanent. And like, how like everyone who I love is, it will be taken from me. And, like sometimes those hard hitting dharmic truths, they have their place. I think when my nervous system is really activated, that's not always the most attuned, wise response for me. But I can say that because I understand that death is a part of life, which is part of kind of what, we talk about impermanence in the dharma, is like, this is a truth, right? In many ways that truth was part of what awakened the Buddha, right? Seeing people who were sick and old and dying. And so understanding this means the reason it's happening is not because I fucked up, like that we are all of the nature to get old, to get sick, to die. And so, at least in that way, that sort of truth kind of relieves this sense of it being deeply personal. Like, there's like, Chulito's life will end, my life will end. There are ways that we can sort of hold this contemplation around impermanence. And maybe it means that like things are more precious, because he's certainly very precious to me. you know, I understand that like there are these kind of like, each of us has in our own lives these sort of personal things that we struggle with, that, like that arise fear, that arise uncertainty, that bring up a sense of grief. And so there's the personal, and then there's also the way that like we are human beings that are in this interconnected web of life. And that like when one part of that web across the world gets pulled on, there's a way that if we live in a more awakened heart, we can feel that. And I think about, the people of Palestine, and the places where people are being exploited and oppressed. I mean, you don't need to go far. We're in the United States, like it's happening here, and it's also happening all over the world, that there is suffering. And sometimes when we come to sort of reckon with the way that like we don't know what's going to happen. I can't say how many phone calls I've made to my representatives, and like, like that, where like this actions that we take sometimes can feel like it's like falling on deaf ears, and it's like it feels so important, and it feels like it's on fire, and we can only do what we can do. And we can get into these spaces where it can feel overwhelming and scary. I think about the election. And regardless of where you sit or who you want to vote for the election, I think like it's a scary experience, because, excuse me, it brings up that unknown. And so just like we're talking about that experience of where to take refuge, sometimes I hear people say like, oh, well, like I shouldn't be taking refuge. I shouldn't be doing these practices because, like there are people in the world that are suffering. And here's the thing, there are people in the world that are suffering, but their suffering is not going to get better by you going underwater. In fact, if you're underwater and overwhelmed by all of the stuff in the world and not taking care, then there's one less person to advocate for their rights, for a ceasefire, for an end to genocide, for an end to racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism and ageism and all of the intersecting oppressions. Like, if we go down, then it's one less voice for good. And so our work is to find ways to take refuge. I mean, I think about the homies, one of the things that, we were doing for a while, and T and I've talked about, we're in the process of reinstating it, is calling our reps at the end of morning meditation to ask them to demand a ceasefire, because we need oftentimes community. Before I was making those calls in the groups, it was like I just felt frozen. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to do it. But if we set a timer for 5 minutes at the end of morning mindfulness, it's a guarantee that I'm going to make that call, because of the power of community. The power not only of community, but community that is practice community, a community that shares values. Those things feel really important. So we take refuge in community. We take refuge in our wise mind that understands that if we can take care of ourselves, then we will be more prepared to be in action for those who need us. And the truth of the Dharma, right? I think about equanimity. I'm going to do everything that I know how to do to make sure that this world is a better place. And I also understand that I have no control over outcomes. So all I can do, I remember one time I watched The Matrix, and I was like, oh my God, because I have anxiety. There's a theme here. Um, I was like, oh my God, what if this is real? What if that's happening right now and actually my body is in like some little tank or something like that? And I realized in that moment, I said to myself, I was like, if that's the truth, then I'm just going to try to do my best. And I think that, like, ultimately, when we're in these situations of struggle and overwhelm and fear, that we just try to do our best, supported by our community and our wise mind, our little Buddha heart mind, and the truth that we're going to just try to do our best, that we're going to take as much action as we can, and also hold that we don't have control over everything. So that is my talk for tonight.
That's what's up right there.